Good morning and welcome. I'm really happy that so many people came from, I think, all over Germany also. Maybe to just have as an introduction how it starts that we have now the symposium. It was when I did the research for this exhibition. It was really interesting when I did the studio visits that several of the artists were really into theory, and several of them were really interested a lot in the speculative or new realism. And while reading and also researching about the artists, I had the feeling that there's somehow in the movement or in the thinking, there are several things in common which could be interesting to discuss. So yesterday we have a retreatment with all the artists and all the philosophers, and it was really interesting. At least I had the feeling, and I think we also find out today, that there are several topics about materialism is really something both sides dealing with in a completely different way, but I think it's interesting, or it was really interesting yesterday to talk about. And I think I would like to introduce Armen Avanessian. We met already in August, I think, the first time, when I came up with the idea that I thought it's interesting to do a symposium about speculative realism. And maybe I give now the word over to you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot to all of you being here. Please remind me if I'm too far or too close to the microphone here. First of all, I mean, as one obviously always does, thanks a lot to the co-organizers here today, Nina Tabasomi and Tom Lamberti from Merve, and Susanne Pfeffer especially, of course, and the whole team. Susanne already mentioned, like, we started talking in August, and when she was still preparing for the show that opened, I think, in September. And so the idea was to maybe try something like the experiment that the show somehow is, in a way, that she did here, to try something similar for the theory conference. And the idea was to maybe do a purely philosophical conference on questions of ontology or materialism and so on. But of course, with always having the art in mind. So as Susanne already indicated, we met like 36 hours earlier. I think, 2 days ago, basically, and to give the speakers that you'll hear today the possibilities to see the show, have a conversation with the artists, but don't worry, you didn't miss anything that you can't also do, like by seeing the show and also following the artist talk series, I think that's organized by the Fridericianum. So, but that's what we did yesterday, and hopefully we'll see some of the things we learned, we saw, we discussed that will also have an influence on today's discussion. The format will be roughly like every speaker's got an hour, and if they show great discipline and only speak for 30 to 35 minutes, we'll have enough time to discuss. So please prepare questions, and I will just give a brief introduction of 10 minutes. Speculations and anonymous materials. I mean, speculations has, as you all know, probably recently become such a buzzword, both in a negative way, financial speculations and so on, but also in a positive way, both in theory but also in the art world. This speculative philosophy has been quite hyped recently. Just a little etymological reminder, I promise it's just the only one today, is speculatio is like basically a translation from the Greek theoria into Latin. And what I find quite interesting about this speculatio, the origin of like speculation, is that it has from the beginning a meaning of investigating, inspecting, but really in the visual way. So it's like Betrachtung or watching. So
there's something wrong with the microphone.
Further away? Closer. But then I feel like I can't see the paper anymore. I can only like try to, like from here, yeah. So from the beginning, I think we should keep that in mind, that speculation might also have like not just a theoretical aspect, but also this visual element. So when we started talking, as Susanne said, end of July or beginning of August, one of the topics was the obvious difficulty dealing or trying to understand this new generation of artists or artworks that are produced, that you hopefully have seen already or will see in this show. There have been attempts to label them in a certain way, like sometimes with a kind of technological reductionism, I think, calling them digital natives, or my personal negative favorite is younger than Jesus. You know, so obviously this is an indication for difficulties to understand what's really happening. Or what's really haunting this new generation. So, and something similar might be the case with these new philosophies that are called like speculative realism or whatever label is used for them. So, from these difficulties, we started discussing and planning this conference. And as I already said, the experimental idea was a bit to come up with an hypothesis and test it out in a way. So our experiment today is to see whether there are some affinities between these different philosophers that we invited from different areas and countries, but also whether there are affinities between the artworks and the artists and this and the philosophy and the speculative philosophy. So, so for sure there's, as I just said, a difficulty for theories, but also for writers or newspaper journalists, even in very positive reviews of the show. I think journalists admitted that they cannot really grasp like what's going on. They're very interested. And we thought that maybe one of the reasons that might be so is that also the vocabulary, or somehow, so to say, the aesthetic grammar that we developed over the last decades does not work anymore that perfectly in trying to understand this young generation of artists. So one idea was to test out and try out new concepts and discuss, for example, instead of the topos of reflexivity, thinking about recursion, like a more productive way of thinking how we do not just think in a meta mode about art or about materials, but include them in the way how artists work. So you see a lot of work, lots of artworks dealing with feedback loops and trying to produce something new. Another thing is, for example, the topos of critique. I think many of the artworks here cannot really be understood sufficiently if one just understands them as critical. So even though they are political or might do something like we all know as institutional critique, they might go beyond, they might do something else. Or another thing is that there are different modes of judgment, so to say, than we're usually used to. We know about induction, we know deduction in science, or the most prominent thing in a little philosophical, but hope it's not too abstract. In Kant, there's the idea of a reflective judgment. So you have a kind of singular, and what artworks do is there's a singular object for which we do not have something general. But so instead of this induction, deduction, or reflexive kind of judgment, looking for a general for a particular, maybe in some of the artworks, but particularly also in the philosophers we're going to listen to, there are new ways of thinking, new ways of inference or judgment, like, for example, abduction, a way of producing new hypotheses, or thinking along the necessity of having to manipulate a certain material in order to start even seeing what's happening, in order to start coming up with hypotheses. So these were just some of the topics we discussed, and that will definitely be a part of our discussion today. But we soon found out that we have to focus on one specific topic, and that was, as you can see from the title of the conference, but also if you read the abstracts, is the question of materiality, material, matter, materialism, but also realism, who are also the recent revival of materialism and realism is an obvious indication for a certain paradigm being over or being overcome, and namely the paradigm of postmodernity. So just really very rough, and I oversimplify, one could say that there has been a kind of modernist or formalist tradition of both doing art but also thinking about art, a progressive work and ongoing work on the medium and the genre and so on. And there has been a kind of postmodern paradigm, I would say, playing with older forms and older references. But I think both these paradigms are in a way exhausted, and they're not really like what we see today, especially in the show in the Fridericianum here, but also, and very explicitly so, there's an anti-postmodernist approach in nearly all the philosophers, or basically all the philosophers that we're going to listen to today. So, as I already said, when thinking about whom to invite, we decided to give space to some recent trends in philosophy that are in one way or the other, sometimes even without wanting so, considered as a speculative or new realism or new materialism. But instead of talking just about labels and names, we'll hopefully talk about really philosophical or ontological issues with regards to different philosophical and artistic attitudes towards science, about the relation between subject and object, and like the by now pretty famous question of correlationism, or what could be called the hypercorrelationism of aesthetics, that of always based on the idea of an aesthetic experience between the subject and the object. So for most of all, probably the central question today is what kind of materials are we talking about, or does it even make sense thinking about materiality in the context of arts? Even that is like something that might be or will be discussed. And are they still the good old materials that we know when they are like by now, but mostly produced in factories or chemical laboratories? And why are they anonymous, as the subtitle of the show suggests? And referring to one of the speakers today who's also going to present. So I started this little introduction with referring to our meetings in Berlin while Susanne was still preparing the show here in Kassel. And I mentioned that because like the last time I was, and I guess like for many of you who are not based in Kassel, the last time you were here, mostly all of us when we come to Kassel, is like very much like related to the Documenta. So the last time I was here at the Documenta, last year or 2 years, now it's 2 years, but also if you think the last show, the last big biennial in Venice, you might have recognized a new trend in art and also art theory. So we've seen something like a rising to prominence of an idea of object-oriented art, which has also been harshly criticized recently in an article by Suhail Malik. So on the one side, in this object-oriented art, nature or matter is no longer seen as the opposite or the other of the human existence, but both objects are seen as animated, and the humans have more and more the status of objects themselves, objects beyond other objects. So in Graham Harman's somehow panpsychic account, objects are rather seen as animated and animistic, and the real as such, I think that's important, cannot be accessed in his view. Such a realism without materialism understands aesthetics as a first philosophy, and non-surprisingly this has been very quickly like inhaled, so to say, or it has become a favorite of aesthetical, art theoretical, but also curatorial discourse. Close?
Yeah.
No, this is worse because I move my hands all the time. So the reason I'm mentioning all this, and I'm coming to an end, is because I think that both when I first saw like the artworks here by many of the artists, but also reading the text by the thinkers that are here today, I had, and I still do, and I guess you will too, have a kind of very different, you will listen and hear quite different speculative positions, and this is so on different levels, so differing to this object-oriented art. So just by finishing my little introduction, let me just mention a few traits of these realist and materialist philosophies that we'll think about and discuss in the next few hours or until the evening. But don't worry, that there'll be loads of controversies already in yesterday's discussion. So this is not a homogeneous, like everyone agrees about, like we're all realist and materialist thing. So just two themes. One, I think, is related to the question or the understanding of the human. Recently there's been loads of discussion about the post-human or post-humanist paradigm. And also today in some of the philosophical positions, I think we are rather, so that's what I suggest, dealing with something like an inhumanism. And the inhuman might be something that is some space within the human, where the human regains the privilege as a locus or a space of the rational within the human. So I think we'll hear, we have some proponents here of a thinking where, so there's a track of thinking that we recently also discussed in Berlin in a conference on accelerationism that thinks about the inhuman as opposed to an anti-humanist or kind of post-humanist approach that equals objects and subjects. So that's one of the themes on the side of the subject. And the second and last one that I want to mention is in analogy to the question of the subject is on the side of the object or matter. And that basically is related to the question of the anonymous materials. In what sense are they anonymous, like as the title of the show suggests? Are they anonymous in a kind of vitalist way, or are they, as I already said, because they come from laboratories and we don't know the exact chemical substances? Or are they anonymous because they not because they share distinct features, but rather because they are complicit in a kind of common task that they fulfill? So I think it will be helpful to keep these questions in mind when discussing matter and materiality in the following, and how and whether at all materials can be manipulated aesthetically or by art or by artists, or whether that's rather something that only science does. So the question about the relationship between science, art, reason, philosophy is also going to be at stake today. So I start with the first speaker today, who is an outstanding example, I think, for this new confidence in philosophy of dealing with the question of materialism and new confidence in